is the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And so a perfect time to cover the suffragists who had distinct ties to New Rochelle. So now I am going to say goodbye to me. You won't see me anymore. I'll be back later in the flesh, but we're now going to go to our presentation. Slideshow. Here, we have some people still joining from the beginning. Okay. And I think we still have people on the side, Ed. Here, okay. So when I first started working on this presentation, it was back in 2017 for LYRIC, which is Learning in Retirement at Iona College. And it was the 100th anniversary, the day that New York passed the suffrage vote. And that was in 2017. And when I was researching, I was stunned at the dearth of information about the suffragists and the years leading up to the movement. But over the past few years, particularly the past few months, the floodgates have opened, partly because of the 100th anniversary, but also as we all seem to be taking a new look at things that we thought we knew and thought what we learned in school were the end of the story. And as everybody's been more involved with the research on the suffrage movement, there have been some really startling findings, and they continue. So this week, our thematic e-newsletter will be focused on the suffragists and the women's movement. And in that e-newsletter, there will be a list of many of the new books. There will be a podcast. There will be a snippet from an oral history of a woman in New Rochelle and talking about, this was Anne Segal, talking about what it was like to get pelted by tomatoes, and also to have tea with Carrie Chapman Catt. And also in that newsletter with the theme of the suffragists, there will be a tribute to Joan Alexander. So if you don't get our e-newsletter each week, it's very easy. All you do is go to our website, and on the homepage there is a place that says subscribe. Type in your email address and you will get our thematic e-newsletters from now on. So hopefully you'll get to see that this week. So here is the sobering beginning. In America in the mid-1850s, once a woman married, she lost her right to property, she lost the right to sue, she lost her right to sign a contract, and if she were to divorce her husband, she also lost her children. On July 15, 1848, an announcement appeared in the Seneca County Courier. It read, "A convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of women will be held in the Wesleyan Chapel at Seneca Falls, New York, on Wednesday and Thursday, the 19th and 20th July current. During the day, the meeting will be exclusively for women, who are earnestly invited to be present. On the second day, when Lucretia Mott of Philadelphia and other ladies and gentlemen will address the convention." It would be the first convention of and for women and was organized by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, two abolitionists who met at the 1840 World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. As women, Mott and Stanton were barred from the convention floor. Their shared indignation led them to ignite the women's rights movement in the United States. The first day, July 19th of the convention, 200 women convened in the chapel, and Stanton read the Declaration of Sentiments and Grievances, a treatise that she had drafted over the previous few days. She had been visiting a friend, and Lucretia Mott, who was long admired by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was 2 decades her junior, was also visiting. So they created this convention within just a few days. And they knew they had to have a platform. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton took the Declaration of Independence and changed it. Her preamble featured the proclamation, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men," and here's where she changed, "and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights." The Declaration of Sentiments and Grievances then detailed the injustices inflicted upon women in the United States and called upon U.S. women to organize and petition for their rights. And at the last moment, Elizabeth Cady Stanton included women's right to vote. On the second day of the convention, men were invited to attend, and some 40 did, including the famous African-American abolitionist Frederick Douglass. That day, the Declaration of Sentiments and Grievances was adopted and signed by the Assembly. The convention also passed 12 resolutions, 11 unanimously, which call for specific equal rights for women. The 9th resolution, which declared it is the duty of the women of this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to elective franchise, was the only one to meet with opposition. After a lengthy debate in which Douglass sided with Stanton in arguing the importance of female enfranchisement, the resolution was finally passed. For proclaiming a woman's right to vote, the Seneca Falls Convention was subjected to public ridicule, and some backers of women's rights withdrew their support. However, this resolution marked the beginning of the women's suffrage movement in America. The Seneca Falls Convention was followed 2 weeks later by an even larger meeting in Rochester, New York. From then on, national women's rights conventions were held annually, providing an important focus for the growing women's suffrage movement. After decades of struggle, the 19th Amendment was finally adopted in 1920, granting women the constitutionally protected right to vote. Almost. 3 of the women who made that possible had distinct ties to New Rochelle: Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, and Carrie Chapman Catt. Born in 1793 in Nantucket, Lucretia Coffin became a teacher when she was only 15 years old. She was one of many children, and she always talked about having grown up in Nantucket, where it was a hardy soul's life, in which her mother commanded the household because her father was at sea so much of the time. And she felt that her growing up in Nantucket made her a very strong woman. So at a very young age, she began her long mission of educating others. In her case, it would be educating people about injustices and attempts to change the world for the better. She was a small, frail-looking woman and apparently exemplified her Quaker tradition in her gentle and tolerant ways. Her strength and determination were well served by her eloquence and speaking abilities. When she was 19, she married James Mott, who was raised as a Quaker as she had been. The Mott family owned Premium Mill, located on the border of New Rochelle and the town of Mamaroneck on the Premium Point Peninsula, as we know it today. We believe the mill served as a stop on the Underground Railroad. We know the Motts were associated with Joseph Carpenter, whose farm in the north end of New Rochelle served as one of the country's largest Underground Railroad stations. And it would make perfect sense that those escaping oppression from the South, the African Americans coming up by train or by foot by the Underground Railroad, would then come across Long Island Sound and have safe, secure place to stay at the Mott Mill before making their way to the Carpenter Farm and then north towards Canada. Premium Premium Mill was the successor of a much older mill that had been located further up the creek in the town of Mamaroneck at Pryor's Bridge. James Mott, the father of Lucretia's husband, took over the business that had been owned by the Palmers and in the Underhills, both Quakers as well. He continued to reside at and operate the old mill for over 40 years while building the Premium Mill with his sons. In 1801, it opened and it became one of the country's largest mills. It was placed half-mile down on the mouth of the bay, whose tide provided the water power and gave much larger storage of water than the older dam. Although the mill itself was at the Mamaroneck end of the mill dam, the dam itself connected with the New Rochelle shore, and the miller's house was at the New Rochelle end. In 1848, 2 years after Lucretia and James were married, here she would give birth to their first son. As I said, the mill was very large with 10 run of stones and was later increased to 12, and every known improvement was made. It was said to have been the largest flour mill in the country at that period. It eventually met its demise because of the wars between Napoleon and England, and then the embargoes and blockades placed on ports. They were all disastrous to the Mott family business, as was the War of 1812. At the close of the war, right after Lucretia and James were living at the Mott home, they sold the property. The business of the mill never recovered the effects of the wars and eventually dwindled its insignificance. Henry Kellogg later became its owner and held it for nearly 40 years. The last use of the mill was for grinding Barrett minerals, after which it was abandoned to decay and torn down in January 1883. Back to Lucretia. This, by the way, is a picture of her personal stamp. In 1821, she had become a Quaker minister and was highly respected for her speaking abilities. She and her husband Sue joined with the more progressive wing of their faith. She was strongly opposed to slavery and advocated successfully for her husband and his family not to buy products made with slave labor. And this prompted her husband, always her supporter, to get out of the cotton trade. She was an early supporter of William Lloyd Garrison and his American Anti-Slavery Society. As a result, she often found herself physically threatened with violence due to her radical views, and later became a prominent organizer in the American Anti-Slavery Society in Philadelphia and was a delegate to their World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. It was here where she met Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and here where they were refused admission on account of their sex. And that led to the Seneca Falls Convention. It's important to note that her husband James presided over that convention. The two would continue their work in abolition and the rights of women, attending regular meetings of the Society of Friends for 30 years. Mrs. Mott was also a writer. Among her published works are Sermons to Medical Students and a discourse on women. She often said she had the perfect marriage. The Motts had, I believe, 6 or 7 children, and she was dedicated to education. She maintained her full routine of a mother after the Civil War and continued her work advocating for the rights of African Americans. She helped to found Swarthmore College in 1864, continued to attend women's rights conventions, and when the movement split into 2 factions in 1869, she tried to get them back together. She died November 11th, 1880 in Shelton Hills, now part of Philadelphia, and was buried next to her husband, James. Susan Bromwell Anthony, yes, that's where the B comes from, Bromwell, was also born into a devout Quaker family. And she was born in Adams, Massachusetts, and this was in 1820. She was one of 6 children and clearly carried on her parents' wishes, as did her siblings. Her parents raised the children to strive to be their best, to contribute positively to the world. Miss Anthony's parents devoted themselves to the causes of abolitionism and temperance, 2 movements that Susan would also champion wholeheartedly and would become a thread through the women's suffrage movement. When Susan was 18, a financial depression forced the Anthony family into bankruptcy. To help pay the family bills, Susan took a job as an assistant teacher at Miss Eunice Kenyon's boarding school in New Rochelle. Unfortunately, I have not been able to find where the school was located. It was probably in a big old house, probably in Residence Park or another South End location. But we do have amazing records of her time here because she was a prolific writer and she wrote home often. And the letters are now part of the Schlesinger Library Radcliffe Institute collection of Harvard. And as you can see from this envelope, it says Miss Susan B. Anthony, New Rochelle, New York. And in the top is Battenkill, New York, July 6th. That was her family's, when she was writing to her brother. So these letters tell us a bit about New Rochelle in 1839. Miss Anthony had hoped to learn about teaching from the principal, that Miss Eunice Kenyon, but when she arrived, she found her seriously ill, and instead of becoming teacher, immediately had to become a nurse. She took over the responsibilities of the classes and the entire household, and she also had to care for Miss Kenyon while the doctors dosed the invalid with huge quantities of calomel, led her until she fainted, blistered her into unconsciousness, and then gave her more. Despite the treatment, Miss Kenyon recovered, but Miss Anthony's experiences here did not improve much at all. In this letter, she writes that she read vicariously from New York newspapers and from books not found in the libraries of good Quakers. She soon aligned herself with the extremist position of abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, as did Lucretia Mott and Wendell Phillips. In a letter to her brother-in-law, Aaron McLean, she wrote about her experience attending a local Quaker meeting here in New Rochelle. And my guess that it would have been the Quaker meeting house that was actually in the town of Mamaroneck, for which Quaker Ridge Road is named. There was also a very active Quaker community, of course, in North Castle and also in Tarrytown, but the closest would have been in Mamaroneck. In this letter, she talks about attending on a Sunday where she hears Stephen Archer, the great Quaker preacher, who was at the head of a large Friends boarding school at Tarrytown, but had come to the meeting house. She writes, he is much younger than I am and wears a sweet smile on his face. But then she goes on to say, the people about here are anti-abolitionists, anti-everything else that's good. The Friends raised quite a fuss about a colored man sitting in the meeting house, and some left on account of it. The man was rich, well-dressed, and very polite, but still the pretended meek followers of Christ could not worship their God and have the sable companion with them. What a lack of Christianity is this? There were 3 colored girls here who have been in the habit of attending Friends meetings where they have lived, but here they are not allowed to sit even on the back seat. One long-faced elder dusted off a seat in the gallery and told them to sit there. Their father was freed by his master and left $60,000, and these girls are educated and refined. She wrote again, the people here are anti-abolitionist and anti-everything else that is good. Quite a damning letter about New Rochelle. Fast forward, May 1851, while in Seneca Falls to attend a lecture by the same abolitionist leader I just mentioned, William Lloyd Garrison, Anthony was introduced to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Although Miss Anthony would first join hands with Stanton on temperance issues, the two would be devoting their efforts to more general cause of women's rights very shortly. In September 1852, Susan B. Anthony attended her first women's rights convention in Syracuse. She began to focus on suffrage as the key to achieving a better place for women in society. She became convinced, in her words, that the right women needed above every other was the right of suffrage. Anthony soon became a regular on the speaking circuit and in legislative halls. In 1854, she traveled to all 54 New York counties to promote women's suffrage and her other concerns of abolition and temperance. In 1856, her outspokenness and tireless efforts on behalf of abolitionism led to her selection as the New York State agent for the American Anti-Slavery Association. Following the Civil War, she began to concentrate almost exclusively on women's issues and especially the campaign for suffrage. Miss Anthony and Mrs. Stanton fought to keep the word male out of the 14th Amendment, then petitioned Congress for a constitutional amendment guaranteeing universal suffrage, suffrage for both the newly freed slaves and for women. Some in Congress listened, most did not. In 1868, Miss Anthony joined Mrs. Stanton to publish a weekly newspaper, The Revolution, which promoted gender equality. The next year, the two women founded the National Women's Suffrage Association. On November 1st, 1872, in Rochester, Miss Anthony, to the great surprise of many, convinced election inspectors to register her to vote. 4 days later, she voted in the election, the straight Republican ticket, she tells Stanton in a letter. 2 weeks later, she was arrested and charged with knowingly casting an illegal vote in a federal election. I haven't had time to see the newspaper today, but I understand that Donald Trump has pardoned Susan B. Anthony today. I'll be interested to read that. I believe it appeared in the Wall Street Journal this morning. Thanks to Bob Daly, who sent me the article, but I couldn't open it. So Miss Anthony hoped to use her case to secure from the Supreme Court a ruling that the recently enacted citizenship and privileges and immunities provisions of the 14th Amendment guaranteed to women as citizens the privilege of voting. In this hope, however, she was disappointed. She did succeed in converting her conviction into an opportunity to promote women's suffrage. She arranged for widespread distribution of a transcript of the trial proceedings, and speaking about them often, the trial served to make Susan B. Anthony a martyr in the eyes of many sympathetic to her cause. Miss Anthony's trial experience and the Supreme Court's narrow interpretation of the 14th Amendment claim in a case brought by a rejected female voter in Minor versus Happersett convinced her that women would not win the vote through the courts and that she must instead turn to the legislatures or the people directly. She traveled extensively around the country promoting state women's suffrage initiatives and legislation, usually against long odds. Miss Anthony first campaigned for a women's suffrage initiative in 1867 in Kansas and moved to Lawrence to promote a women's suffrage amendment that was to be voted on by Kansas males. The measure lost by a 3-to-1 margin. Eventually, women started achieving success in the West, however, which was far more receptive to other regions of the country. In July 1890, she would take great pleasure in watching Wyoming be admitted as the first state in the nation to allow women to vote. Utah, Colorado, yay Colorado, we have somebody from Colorado on the call tonight, and Wyoming would fall into line over the next decade. In 1896, Anthony spent 8 months campaigning for suffrage in California, but the measure went down to defeat. Although she recognized that the right for women to vote would first come in the Western states, her primary focus remained on securing a women's suffrage amendment to the United States Constitution. Each year, the National Women's Suffrage Association would hold its annual meeting in the nation's capital, and Anthony would take the opportunity to lobby politicians for suffrage. A friend of Anthony's wrote, quote, "The members of Congress always knew when Miss Anthony had arrived in Washington," unquote. In 1878, she succeeded for the first time in getting a proposed constitutional amendment introduced in Congress. The same measure would be introduced in identical form for each of the next 41 years. Anthony's last appearance before the Senate Select Committee on Women's Suffrage was in 1902. That year, her longtime friend and crusader, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, died. Susan B. Anthony's last public speech was in Washington on her 86th birthday, which was February 15th, 1906. She spoke of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and the many other women who had battled at her side, some for over half a century for women's suffrage. She ended her speech with an optimistic note. With such a worthy cause as theirs, she said, failure is impossible. Less than a month later, on March 13th, Anthony died in her home in Rochester. 10,000 mourners attended the funeral of the woman who had devoted a lifetime to the cause of justice for women. Anticipating the day a few years earlier at a family reunion, Miss Anthony had requested, when it is a funeral, remember there should be no tears. Pass on and go on with the work. The woman who took the gavel and went on with the work and to the ratification of the 19th Amendment was Carrie Chapman Catt. Carrie Clinton Lane was born January 9, 1859 in Ripon, Wisconsin, the second of 3 children. The family would soon move to Iowa near Charles City, and in 1880 she graduated from the Iowa Agricultural College and Model Farm in Ames, now Iowa State University. She was at the top of her class, having worked her way through school by washing dishes, working in the school library, and teaching. She was also the only woman in her graduating class. After college, she returned to Charles City to work as a law clerk and in nearby Mason City as a school teacher and then a principal. In 1883, she became one of the first women in the nation to be appointed superintendent of schools. In February 1885, Lane married Leo Chapman, editor and publisher of the Mason City Republican. It was a short marriage, as Mr. Chapman died of typhoid fever the following year in San Francisco, where he had gone to seek new employment. Arriving a few days after her husband's death, the young widow decided to remain in San Francisco, where she was employed by a newspaper for part-time. In 1887, she returned to Charles City and joined the Iowa Women's Suffrage Association, for which she worked as a professional writer and lecturer. After a short time, she became the group's recording secretary, and from 1890 to 1892, she served as the Iowa's Association state organizer. At the time of Carrie Chapman's rise to her state organization's highest office, in June 1890, she married George Catt, a fellow Iowa Agricultural College alumnus she'd met during a stay in San Francisco. He encouraged her suffrage activity. Mrs. Catt began work nationally for the National American Women's Suffrage Association, speaking in 1890 at its Washington, D.C. convention. In the following months, Catt's work and her writing and speaking engagements established her reputation as a leading suffragist. In 1892, she was asked by Susan B. Anthony to address Congress on the proposed suffrage amendment. In 1900, she succeeded Anthony as the National American Women's Suffrage Association president. From then on, her time was spent primarily in speech making, planning campaigns, organizing women, and gaining political experience. In 1902, she helped organize the International Women's Suffrage Alliance, which eventually incorporated sympathetic associations in 32 nations. In 1904, she resigned her presidency in order to care for her ailing husband. His death in October 1905, followed by the deaths of Susan B. Anthony's, Catt's younger brother William, and her mother, all in a 2-year span, left Catt grief-stricken. Her doctor and her friends encouraged her to travel abroad. As a result, she spent much of the following 8 years as international WSA president, promoting equal suffrage rights worldwide. Meanwhile, momentum was building in the United States. A massive parade in Washington called for a constitutional amendment in 1913. It was organized by Alice Paul for the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Held on March 3rd, one day before the inauguration of President Woodrow Wilson, the parade featured 8,000 marchers, including 9 bands, 4 mounted brigades, 20 floats, and a performance near the Treasury building. If any of you saw that excellent documentary on Channel 13, you saw what happened during this march. The women were confronted by angry mobs of men overturning their trucks, stampeding against the women and their large crowds. Many of them were greatly and gravely injured, and many were arrested to spend time in prison. Catt returned to the United States 2 years later in 1915 to resume the leadership of the American Suffrage Association, which had become badly divided under the leadership of Anna Howard Shaw. In 1916, at a convention at Atlantic City, New Jersey, what a strange place for a women's suffrage convention, Catt unveiled her winning plan to campaign simultaneously for suffrage on both the state and federal levels and to compromise for partial suffrage in the states resisting change. When Mrs. Catt took the leadership of the movement, World War I was raging abroad and was about to forever change the American woman. From the time we entered the war in 1917, women took increasingly critical roles on the home front. As written in the book, New Rochelle, Her Role in the Great War, quote, women were caring for the sick and wounded, providing comfort for the men in camp and overseas, looking for the needs of the families left behind, providing food and other materials, and stepping into places in the business and industrial world left vacant. Women across America have become independent and more confident. Their newfound roles fueled the work of the suffrage movement, propelling it across the finish line. In this photo, a World War victory garden has been transformed into a women's suffrage garden plot. On March 11th, 1916, New Rochelle's pioneer newspaper related the history of the Equal Franchise League of New Rochelle, which began in 1908. The article refers to the group as a club of, quote, plucky women. The next month, the paper had a front page article on a meeting to be held at the Trinity Parish Hall. The growing ranks, here's the parish hall here. The growing ranks of members had grown so rapidly that the meetings could no longer be held in the private homes, but instead were being held at the New Rochelle Public Library, the library located and still standing on Main Street at the corner of Pintard, and in the parish house, just diagonally across from us here in the library next to Trinity St. Paul's Church. This insert, and I apologize for the picture, this is a insert that appeared in 1917. It was called the New Rochelle Daily Star, and I was given these little bits and pieces that I pieced together like a puzzle that we're now going to have to try and do archivally. This was a fascinating insert that was put out by the local organization, the Equal Franchise for Women, a real good promotional piece where they not only profiled the women who had been active in the movement, they showed their picture with their children, and they interviewed several prominent male individuals who spoke very strongly in favor of the suffrage movement. There's no date on this, but my guess is it probably appeared the week before the November 3rd election for women's right to vote in New York State. In this article, in one of the articles, Robert Forbes, who was the publisher of the local newspaper, pointed out that women had had partial suffrage in New Rochelle before 1899. That's when the town of New Rochelle and the village of New Rochelle combined and became incorporated as a city. The city charter was drawn up and it denied women the right to vote. He says in his piece, his mother had in fact voted at town hall in the 1850s. There's another interesting piece by George Watson, who was a very well-known builder in the community. He said he was all for women voting as long as they didn't picket. He was not in favor of women picketing as they had been down in Washington, D.C. Many other testimonials from men and women spoke about the injustice of taxation without representation, how educated women were more qualified to vote than uneducated men, how suffrage was good for men, women, and their children, and how the war effort by women had proved their equal footing. In this insert, we also have an article by Carrie Chapman Catt, who at the time was at the helm of the movement, and around the same time was leading this major fall 1917 parade in New York City. Here in this, at the parade, she was quoted as saying, "Everybody counts in applying democracy, and there will never be a true democracy until every responsible and law-abiding adult in it, without regard to race, sex, color, or creed, has his or her own inalienable and unpurchasable voice in government." Under her dynamic leadership, the Suffrage Association would finally win the backing of the U.S. House and Senate, as well as state support for the amendment's ratification. Again, I apologize for this picture. This came from the Library of Congress, one of the few. It's actually the cover of the Pensacola Journal on August 19th, 1920. So after a long and arduous struggle, New York had granted women the right to vote in November 1917. I should comment that in that same New Rochelle Pioneer newspaper that had talked about the plucky women, the election decision on November 3rd, the suffrage part of the election decision didn't appear in the newspaper until the next week. It was a weekly newspaper, November 10th, and it was a little article on the 4th page of the newspaper. Back to 1917, the women had gotten the right to vote in New York, and by 1918, President Wilson was finally converted to the cause. What would become the 19th Amendment was first introduced to Congress in 1878, as we saw, but it would take 41 years and multiple rejections for it to finally pass. After it was approved by Congress in 1919, it was sent to the states for ratification, and the last state to do so though the women's suffrage had always faced the biggest obstacles in southern states, Tennessee was the deciding 36th state to ratify the amendment by a slim margin on August 18th, 1920. In the caption of this newspaper picture, it said, "Tennessee House of Representatives in a special suffrage session which ratified the suffrage amendment. This completes ratification, giving women of the entire nation the vote." The 19th Amendment, granting the women the right to vote, became the law of the land 100 years ago today. The presidential election of 1920 was the first in which women were eligible to vote nationwide. Carrie Chapman Catt and her loyal friend and partner, Mary Hay, moved to this house in Newcastle in 1919 and would remain there until 1928. She found the house an ideal place to rest her tired nerves since the land was too steep to farm productively. However, later on, she did start limited farming, including raising cattle and chickens on the land, and made some significant modifications on the property. She also claimed to a group of guests during the years of Prohibition that she bought the land to prevent anyone from using its juniper berries to make gin. After 9 years, she and Hay, who had never embraced the rural lifestyle, moved out. During this these years, she stepped down from the presidency after its victory, the presidency of the Suffrage Association, but continued her work for equal suffrage, promoting education of the newly enfranchised by founding the new League of Women Voters and serving as its honorary president for the rest of her life. In 1923, with Nettie Rogers Schuller, she published Women's Suffrage and Politics, the Inner Story of the Suffrage Movement. In her later years, Catt's interest broadened to include the causes of world peace and child labor. She founded the National Committee on the Cause and Cure of War in 1925, serving as its chair until 1932 and its honorary chair thereafter. She also supported the League of Nations and later the United Nations. In 1928, after leaving Northern Westchester, Carrie Chapman Catt chose New Rochelle as her final home. The community of about 30,000 had so many things going for it: lovely neighborhoods, a bustling downtown, beautiful views of Long Island Sound, and an easy train ride to New York City. Here is her home at 120 Payne Avenue, and it was here where she would continue her global efforts for peace and disarmament, as well as bringing women together for dialogue and conversations on a variety of causes that she found important. In 1930, she was given the annual Pictorial Review Award for Outstanding Achievement. In 1931, Mrs. Catt was selected as one of America's 12 greatest women living at this time by the readers of Good Housekeeping magazine and a jury of 5 eminent men. In 1933, Mrs. Catt was selected as one of the 3 greatest living American women by readers of the New York Evening Journal. That same year, she received an award in recognition of her efforts to bring about a better understanding between Christians and Jews. On the left, you see pictures of her in her New Rochelle house. On the top, her library. She was an avid reader, and at work in her sunroom below. She also had gorgeous gardens. She was a member of the New Rochelle Women's Club, the Women's Club of New Rochelle. Mary Jane Reddington's listening, so I better get it right. And when they built their beautiful clubhouse that later would serve as the Zion Baptist Church until a devastating fire just a few years ago, this is this Tudor building at the corner of Lockwood and now Memorial Highway. Mrs. Catt paid for the furnishings in one of the rooms, pictured here. She was interviewed in the Club Candle, which was the Women's Club extraordinary publication, and was, of course, active with it because the Women's Club was the activist group for the community, taking on all kinds of different causes, having forums, having discussions, educating the women of the community and other members as to worldly things going on, as well as local affairs. It was really quite a remarkable organization, and we're very fortunate at the New Rochelle Library to have its archives. Mrs. Catt was also a member of the Thomas Paine National Association. She mentions in a Club Candle, the Women's Club publication, when she bought the house, she was unaware that Thomas Paine's cottage was just down the street, but was just delighted to learn that because, of course, Thomas Paine was a very early believer and promoter of women's rights and a woman's right and African Americans' rights to vote. And here, Carrie Chapman Catt would make her final home just up the street from where the very forward-thinking pamphleteer had made his final home. She also continued her work with the Women's Christian Temperance Society, which was such a big deal in New Rochelle. It had its own building, pictured here, which was unfortunately torn down when I-95 came through. And she was very involved with the New Rochelle Public Library. Again, pictured here at its location when it was housed in the building that's still at the corner of Main Street and Pintard Avenue. In fact, in our collection, we have this letter from Mrs. Catt to Miss Audrey Lee Hill at the Public Library. Dear Ms. Hill, I think your statement is very clear and I hope it will appeal to the public. But what they will think about raising $15,000 remains to be seen. Enclosed is my contribution of $25, which will not help very much, but is the best I can do. In the event you do not get enough with which you to do all you want, I suggest that you take one of the three things, preferably filming the old newspapers, and let the others come when times are more prosperous, if they are. This was in 1937, and the library was doing a campaign to preserve the local history collection. Of course, Mrs. Catt was a big promoter. And here she's pictured on her 81st birthday. The Associated Press carried this photograph of New Rochelle's esteemed resident across the country. This was the caption: "She hopes for peace. Bloodshed and war in Europe and in the Far East can't dim Mrs. Carrie Chapman Catt's forecast for peace, made as the famous feminist observed her 81st birthday, January 5th, at New Rochelle, New York. She expressed confidence that the current wars are the finishing off of the long bloodletting of the world." Carrie Chapman Catt died of heart failure at her New Rochelle home on March 9th, 1947. At Woodlawn Cemetery in the North Bronx, or Woodlawn, New York, in the Bronx, she's buried alongside her longtime companion, Mary Garrett Hay, who was also a New York State suffragist with whom she lived with for over 20 years. Interesting, Elizabeth Cady Stanton is also buried at Woodlawn Cemetery, and here's her tombstone. And this is a picture of Mrs. Catt's house today at 120 Payne Avenue. There is a plaque in front, and I would dearly want this house to be listed on the National Register, or at least a locally designated landmark, so it can forever be protected. And we have a plaque for Carrie Chapman Catt. She was one of the initial inductees to the New Rochelle Walk of Fame right outside of the library. On August 26th, I would like to conclude with what she had to say, celebrating the winning of the vote for women across the country. "The vote is the emblem of your equality, women of America, the guarantee of your liberty. That vote of yours has cost millions of dollars and the lives of thousands of women. Money to carry on this work has been given usually as a sacrifice, and thousands of women have gone without things they wanted and could have had in order that they might help get the vote for you. Women have suffered agony of soul, which you can never comprehend, that you and your daughters might inherit political freedom. That vote has been costly. Prize it." She goes on to say, "The vote is a power, a weapon of offense and defense, a prayer. Understand what it means and what it can do for your country. Use it intelligently, conscientiously, prayerfully. No soldier in this great suffrage army has labored and suffered to get a place for you. Their motive has been the hope that women would aim higher than their own selfish ambitions, that they would serve the common good. The vote is won. 72 years, the battle for this privilege has been waged, but human affairs with their eternal change move on without pause. Progress is calling to you to make no pause. Act." And that concludes our program on the leading suffragists with ties to New Rochelle. I'm going to now open it up for questions. I'll also open up the chat. Ed, if we could unmute everybody. And if you want to speak, if you can unmute yourself. And then anybody have any comments?
Barbara, I thought that was excellent. George Latimer, I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you, George, and thank you for taking time out of your incredibly busy schedule, and for all you've been doing for the county. Thank you.
Well, like Damon Marr, we could do nothing better on this anniversary of 100 years since the vote than to be part of this program. So thanks for putting it on.
Thank you.
Barbara,
Yes,
Mary Jane Reddington.
I recognize the voice.
I just wanted to say once again, the program was excellent and your information is boundless. And I certainly appreciate your doing this. And I also appreciate the role that you mentioned the Women's Club of New Rochelle played. There were many, many women in those early days who were very, very important in the suffragist movement. And if one were to look at a yearbook, which you so graciously took when we had to cease to exist, we had to close our doors, you will see the importance of the Women's Club in so many events and organizations in the city of New Rochelle. So once again, my heartfelt gratitude to you.
And ours to you, Mary Jane, for your leadership in so many of those organizations, including the Women's Club, including the Board of Education. I would be here all evening to tell everybody about all that you've done, but we all are very grateful to you and what you've done for our community.
Thank you. That's very kind of you.
Anne, did you want to say something?
I had a question, and I don't know the answer. Were there no women of color in New Rochelle who were involved in this movement?
Yes, there were. In fact, when in that insert that I showed you, I came across a list of the board members. One of the board members, it said, was responsible for the Colored Women's Unit. So I went up to the directories today to find her name, because in the directories, these are the phone directories of the time, we have them back to 1901. For many years, they would put in parentheses the letter C or COL for the people who were of color in the phone directories. So I was curious if this board member was a person of color or a white woman who was in charge of the women of color. She was not listed with a C, so I am pretty convinced that it was a white woman who was in charge. But this is one of the components, or one of the aspects of the suffrage movement that has recently come out and is fascinating. The League of Women Voters, who are represented in the session tonight, have done a great job with bringing in one of the writers who has explored, researched the influence of African-American women in this movement. When we went to school, we did not learn that. We learned a little about Seneca Falls, and we learned about their sashes, but we didn't learn about the women of color had significance, and not only the women of color, but also the Native American women, particularly the Iroquois women. And their location by Seneca Falls was a really important aspect. Right. Fortunately, with the 100th anniversary, with people taking a new look at our history in a new lens, these kinds of things are coming out. And I'm hoping that more and more and more will be revealed as we go on. There was a very important women's organization in New Rochelle that was first called the Colored Women's Club, and then it was renamed the F. Willa Davis Women's Club. It was started by domestics for other domestics coming up from the South to help them get settled, to get apartments, to get clothing, to get jobs. And they became very important in the community too. My guess is that organization, because they were in full force back in 1917, I'm sure had a role in this too. Unfortunately, I don't have their archives and we don't know where the documents are. So I'm always hopeful that someone, when they're cleaning house, will recognize that these documents are important and bring them to New Rochelle, where our wonderful full-time archivist, David Rose, we'll carefully preserve them, and then we'll digitize them and make them available to the public.
Yeah, there was a piece in the Times earlier this week about, the role of the women of color.
Yes, there was an insert, I have them all right here, an insert in the Times, in the Journal News, and the Wall Street Journal, and today's Times had a poster. So that was great. I do hope you all get a chance to see this e-blast of ours, because this podcast that the New York Humanities has done is fascinating also. And there will be more and more snippets coming out, pieces coming out that I think that's what's so great about history, is that it never ends. You keep learning more, and you get different lenses all of the time.
Well, you are a treasure because you share the history of New Rochelle with us. And this has been just wonderful.
Well, I'm lucky because the library has such a great local history collection. What my next dive is going to be into the Radcliffe Institute collection, because when I was researching this, that's where I learned about Susan B. Anthony's letters there. One of her letters, she goes into great lengths of talking about how she's taken up cultivating silkworms in New Rochelle. Now, those of us who live in the South End, or have lived in the South End, know the mulberry trees and the berries when they come down. Well, she was breeding silkworms in the mulberry trees while she was living here. And that's what makes me think she lived in the South End of New Rochelle. But we can learn more about New Rochelle from her other letters.
Thank you so much. Is this your last one, or you have another one?
Well, yeah, actually, I'm going to put out an invitation. Waikagill Crossroads Neighborhood Association has asked me to do the history of Waikagill. So you'll all be invited to that. I'll send that out. And I am going to repeat Wish You Were Here. And if I get enough positive response, I'll continue these every other week, as long as my trusty right hand, Ed Roddy's willing to help me out. We'll continue. It's a good lockdown activity, and I'm happy to do it. So
thank you.
We'll keep you posted. So if nobody else has any comments.
Barbara, it's Judy.
Hi, Judy.
Hi, and Don. Thank you. Just thank you. I learned so much, and my mind has been expanded. Thank you so much. You're great. Just great.
Well, thank you, Judy. And there's another wonderful woman. We have a lot of wonderful women of New Rochelle on this session. Judy has been great with doing as a volunteer here at the library with English Conversation, and we missed you, Judy, and we missed those sessions. And
I miss it.
Looking forward to coming back. And now I will put in a plug for the library. We are open for browsing every day, but Sunday we have hours. You can see that on our website as well. We still have the curbside activity, and you can still download all kinds of materials with your through our online resources.
Thank you very much. Again.
Okay, thank you all, and have a good evening.